My name is Biandri Joubert, and I'm from South Africa, as Kathy has said, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, and I'm based in the School of Law. So apologies, I just want to do this. In my current and past research, I'm particularly interested in the safe international trade of agricultural products through science-based and legally justified application of what's called sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So sanitary and phytosanitary measures, or SPS measures for short, are measures aimed at the protection of human, animal, and plant life and health within the World Trade Organization member territories, from risks associated with the introduction and spread of pests and diseases into such territories through trade. The World Trade Organization, through its agreement on the application of these SPS measures, guides the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and it provides quite a rigorous, quite a complicated set of guiding principles, rights, and obligations, and these are applicable to all member states. The member states are essentially all large trading countries within the world. There are very few countries in the world that are not members of the World Trade Organization. So these rights, principles, and obligations have quite far-reaching effects. So within this field, I'm particularly interested in how these measures, which include laws, decrees, regulations, and that type of thing, act as non-tariff barriers to trade. And for the larger part of the past few years, I've specifically been interested in the complexity and challenges in the international trade of agricultural products subject to these measures, but in a South African context. So I live and research in South Africa. I am a Zimbabwean national. And so the complexity of moving agricultural products across borders within Southern Africa more broadly is something that I am very, very interested in both a practical sense, but also in an academic sense. So I looked at the importance of national legislative frameworks in the creation of what are essentially behind the border measures. And like I said, measures are decrees, laws, regulations, and that type of thing. And in as far as that this national legislative framework is a translator of international rights, obligations, and principles into legally enforceable rights, obligations, principles, processes, procedures, and that type of thing at a national level. So trading in agricultural products is a complex process, and it involves the overlapping competence and expertise of a very long list of people. So whether it's plant products or animal products or plants or animals themselves being imported or exported, the list of people involved, the list of disciplines involved in this type of process, in this system is long, it is complicated, and it's very intertwining and overlapping. So it provides a very interesting field of research for someone such as myself that's interested in the movement of agricultural products, but importantly in the safe and sustainable and just generally justified movement of products across borders. So the primary objective of this research was to identify and explore persistent challenges to the prevention and resolution of trade barriers or disputes connected to sanitary and phytosanitary measures in the South African context. And very much related to this is the objective to recommend potential solutions to these identified challenges, and with a specific focus on looking at barriers, looking at disputes that are beyond the scope of resolution by the World Trade Organization. So looking at practically what happens when a dispute or a barrier arises and it isn't something that falls within the very narrow competence of the World Trade Organization. So in other words, what happens if you're an individual sitting with these problems, or if these problems are arising and you don't actually know that there is some sort of legal action that can be taken or practical action that can be taken to resolve this barrier. So a lot of research goes into dispute resolution within the World Trade Organization sphere, and I wanted to take a step back and look at the national level before these measures are even put in place, or once they are put in place by a national government, what happens if there is some sort of dispute that isn't necessarily being brought by a trading partner, but rather potentially by someone within the industry itself. So I did look at barriers that are not necessarily directly related to the science itself, because these measures are justified on principles of science. And of course, you've got lawyers involved in this as well, because there's the legal aspect to the understanding of what is sufficient, what is necessary, and that type of thing. But of course, where it was relevant, barriers related to science were also included. So, as I've said, I explored matters that affected individuals, and in my particular research, it was individuals within the red meat industry. So South Africa's agricultural industry has faced significant challenges related to the country's inability to proactively avoid or mitigate the impacts, excuse me, of the outbreak of certain diseases that the World Organization for Animal Health, which was formerly founded as the OIE, has listed as disease of particular concern to trade. So my PhD research focused on foot and mouth disease in particular, and as I've said, it was in the red meat industry of South Africa. At the beginning of my research, I was faced with a decision to take either a very theoretical route and stay primarily in a legal doctrinal research-based lane, or to take the route of applying a mixed method approach in an attempt to identify barriers to trade in an SBS context that are potentially beyond the purely legal boundaries. So I chose option 2 for a variety of reasons. I'm not saying option 1 would have been a wrong decision, but I chose option 2 for a number of reasons. One of them being a real strong desire to actually engage within the industry in qualitative research as well. And it ended up being a very interesting couple of years in the end. So I chose option 2 just to, like I said, to answer questions that I don't think I would have been able to answer with a purely doctrinal legal approach. And I unfortunately don't have solutions to all the factors influencing the barriers to trade in agricultural products subject to SBS measures in South Africa. But a particularly worrying finding, in my view, especially as someone with a legal background, was that the national legislative framework regulating these measures, and when I say regulating these measures, I don't mean just the application of them or just the enforcement of them. I mean the creation of them, what procedures need to be followed, what needs to be taken into account, and that type of thing. So the legislative framework regulating these measures and the development thereof is a barrier to trade in itself in these products. So that's a really significant finding for a country that is so reliant on agricultural trade. So this relates largely to the absence of specific incorporation of SBS rights, obligations, and principles into the framework, and an ineffective incorporation of provisions that show both an appreciation for the necessity of complexity, so complexity is entirely necessary, but also an ability to incorporate complexity. So trade into or out of any country happens with a broader, within a broader country context as well. And in South Africa, the external factors influencing the resolution of barriers to trade that I research are not insignificant. And I suppose this is probably true of any field of law in South Africa. It exists within a very complicated social and political environment with a long history of a number of injustices, inequality, and that type of thing. And so, unfortunately, trade isn't unaffected by this either. So trade into and out of South Africa takes place in a context of extremes. There are factors such as a thriving informal versus a formal sector to consider, as well as a historical and current climate of inequality and socioeconomic hardship. So these external factors matter in research like this, because despite the science-based basis of SBS measures, despite the desire to apply legal principles in the creation of measures, in the application of them, their design and application in such a context are influenced by these external factors, and so are the barriers, and so are the resolution, and ultimately individuals' ability to export or not are influenced by this, especially in a field where a country can lose its disease status as a whole, as opposed to a single farm or a single province or a single county or whatever it might be. So I approach this complexity by means of qualitative research, interviews, quantitative text analysis, descriptive statistics, and doctrinal legal research. And importantly, I think for today's presentation is I had to cross the boundaries of law and venture into other fields such as animal health, for example, to try and make sense of the diseases affecting the red meat industry, but in an attempt to try and make sense of the barriers and to try and make sense of the resolution of these barriers as well. So the South African agricultural industry is very vulnerable to trade bans related to the outbreaks of diseases such as foot and mouth disease and more recently highly pathogenic avian influenza. So the vulnerability stems from a number of systemic issues, including the growing inability to proactively prevent the spread of these diseases. There are a number of reasons for this. One of the large ones is capacity constraints, departments just not having the manpower to really physically enforce control areas and that type of thing, or the inability to effectively coerce farmers or industries into cooperation and into not moving animals within the country when certain outbreaks have been recorded. So in the event of an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, for example, outside of a recognized zone, such as the Kruger National Park, there's usually an almost immediate ban in the export of red meat products from South Africa into other countries. And the other countries include directly neighboring countries, but they also include countries in other continents. And even without these frequent and more recent outbreaks, exporting red meat from South Africa has already been faced with a number of challenges that, although theoretically overcomable, haven't in practice been overcome. So if you consider the size of South Africa and the often very localized outbreaks in limited areas within the province, or usually towards the northern part of the country, you can imagine the impact that such a ban will have on farming operations, potentially 1,000+ kilometers away. So a ban is understandable from trading partners. And so there's a constant balance. You can understand why certain bans are required. And the spread of diseases across borders is deeply undesirable. I don't think very many people can argue with that. But that does not mean that the consequences of such a ban are not severe on the industry, and that an industry that has immediately lost market access and faces an indefinite period of uncertainty is very deeply impacted by this. And from that, there is a knock-on effect. So in a country where you have this, as I've described, these external factors already influencing people's ability to cooperate with regulations, to implement control measures and that type of thing, an immediate loss of a market limits the amount of, quite frankly, money available to continue exercising sustainable practices, to continue exercising any number of controls to ensure safety. And so that is part of the complexity that I was talking about, for which I don't have answers yet as to how to manage that. But what I do know is that there's a lot of potential for transdisciplinary research in enhancing international agricultural trade by removing certain barriers within South Africa, within the broader African continent. So the problems faced in the SBS-related South African import and export industry cannot be remedied by a single discipline or approach. And this is something that I'm quite passionate about, is the potential for transdisciplinary cooperation and research within teams, within individuals, whatever it might be. There are a lot of questions that need answering or that need identifying. So I think a big part of my research has been identifying questions and identifying problems, rather than necessarily coming up for a solution for them yet, because I'm acutely aware of the fact that that is not something that I myself can magically do on my own. But I think it makes for a very exciting field of research within South Africa, within Africa, for agricultural trade. So the complexity necessitates a transdisciplinary approach, and I have made recommendations, as have others, but many issues, as I've said, remain unresolved and unresearched. A set of questions that I grapple with is how, in a developing country context, and also acutely aware that you can't just generalize across developing countries. South Africa has very different problems to Zimbabwe, has very different problems to Namibia, to Uganda, to Ghana, to Senegal. We can't really just broadly say, well, this is how we're going to go about resolving the problems that developing countries face. But maybe a more fruitful way of doing that is saying, okay, well, which are common problems that perhaps do have generalizable potential, and then start with that, and then move into the much more country-specific or even province or county-specific problems within this field. So how can these principal rights and obligations, which are critical for ensuring food safety and human, plant, and animal health in trade, be applied in a manner that is not only sustainable, but with reduced barriers? And these are the questions that I ask. And again, like I say, I wish I had all the answers, but I think it's exciting that they're even being asked. And so how can this complexity be broken up into these practical and actionable changes? And I always like to remind myself during this research, and whenever I present on it or before I present on it, that the production and consumption, on the production and consumption sides of this field and the products I'm researching, it's not always big corporates that participate in import and export products. In a South African context and a broadly African context, there are very many mid to large size farming operations. Many of them are family owned, and an increasing number of them are not products of generational wealth. So an additional layer of challenges emerges when removing barriers for such operations. And access to resources and the cost of compliance are just really two examples. So research that leads to practical solutions and access to market, and that balances the various sustainable development goals and production practices with barrier removal, has the potential to make a large and very positive impact in South African and other African countries. And of course, coming back to the reminder that we have that this happens within a broader political and social context. And so solving trade-related issues requires cooperation with researchers in fields that are looking at, well, why do we have this socioeconomic inequality? Why are certain farming practices being perpetuated despite science, despite quite common knowledge dictating that those methods are perhaps outdated or problematic in some sort of way, rather than coming with the simplified type of view that, oh, well, this is just people not wanting to comply. So I think as far as that is concerned, it is at least an argument for the potential of transdisciplinary research and its benefits. So as I've said earlier, my view is that in South Africa and a broader African context, SPS measures and the barriers that are prevalent across the different products require this transdisciplinary process. And the rights and obligations might stem from a legal agreement, but the solution is definitely not limited to international trade lawyers. And this is particularly true if any sort of sustainability measures are to be balanced with this. So these measures must be scientifically justified, and that then, of course, implies a reliance on a variety of scientific fields of expertise involved in regulation and assessment of measures. And on the screen here, I've just listed a couple of fields within this broader international trade field that interact. Within the creation of these measures, you've got considerations from veterinary sciences, agricultural sciences, trade policy, social sciences. There's a very big amount of scope for data science and technology and that type of thing within this field. And so even though I list international trade law first, that's probably just my bias as an international trade lawyer. It isn't the only field of expertise within this field that can make a very big difference. So in conclusion, and I apologize, I see how I've gone over time with a few minutes, addressing the research gaps, what is next? And in my case, what is next is focusing on other agricultural products. So I've looked at meat, I've looked at wild meat, I've started looking at vegetables and fruit and that type of thing this year as well during my postdoc. And what's next for me and for other researchers, hopefully, is a lot more focus on transdisciplinary research, a lot more collaboration, a lot more listening. I'm a very big proponent of engaging with stakeholders, engaging with the industry itself, and then tackling these questions in an academic way, having followed a very specific route of listening and discussing first. So thank you very much. If anyone would like to contact me, my contact details are on the screen now, and I'd be very happy to answer questions via email. And again, I apologize for going over time.
Thank you, Biandri. Completely fine about going over time. That's fine. We do have time today, so it's excellent to hear about your research in full. I will ask a question. I have a couple of questions. The first is, and I know that you said actually that there are even restraints in within your own region about looking to pass what you're gaining an understanding of into other areas in your region. So I guess this might be a void question, but then can you see that your research questions even might be able to be applied in other parts of the world? And I ask that with the bias of being an Australian. So,
thank you for the question, Kathy. I'd like to think so. I'd like to think at least the questions I'm asking, as far as asking them to try and understand what the practical problems on the ground are. Is perhaps a method rather that could be applied in other parts of the world. Australia happens to have a very good example of a very effective application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. I mean, for foreigners flying into out of Australia, sorry, it's always something everyone's very aware of. If you watch border security, that kind of security preventing vegetables or fruit or food or whatever it might be from coming in just through passenger transport. That's on a much bigger scale, of course, when it comes to shipments via cargo ship or whatever it might be. But I do think even in a country such as Australia, where you do have this very advanced system, very well communicative departments within the country, that speaking to an industry itself, trying to understand on the ground, I always say boots in the dirt, following that methodology, there would probably still be some potential for this, at least the method of getting to the questions to be applied there. But in other African countries, certainly, because I think my approach isn't necessarily coming with the set of questions to answer yet, but it's coming with a set of questions to find out which questions I need to answer at a later stage. And I think for myself personally, that's very exciting, but I think it would be more exciting to be doing that in a bigger research group.
Thank you for that. I have another question here as well. And that is relating to if there are any specific collaborative approaches or models that you would propose for the development and enforcement of SPS regulations.
So I think I would look at development and enforcement separately. Development is something that I think there's a lot of benefit to understanding what the let's say the more theoretical, the more academic requirements are there. The enforcement, though, when it comes to developing measures and having an enforcement clause or an enforcement requirements, I can't list a specific model or something like that. But what I can say how my approach would be is to very much understand these broader factors that I've been talking about within the country itself. So why is it we've got a legislative framework? It might be very problematic, but what we have already isn't enforced. So why is that? So I'm a bit of a critical legal academic in that sense, because I'm very pro having good regulation and good legislation and that type of thing. But I don't think there's any point in having it if you don't understand why it's not enforceable, or if you don't consider that it's perhaps creating further barriers to entry for people that it is in theory intended to benefit.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. And I'm glad we were able to get to you a bit sooner.